Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. I walked through the narrow, dimly lit halls of the vintage store, the musty air carrying the scent of old leather and forgotten memories. My eyes scanned the shelves, looking for nothing in particular, just letting my feet guide me through the maze of worn-out furniture and dust-covered trinkets. The place was quiet, almost eerily so. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the room, mixing with the soft ticking of clocks scattered on the walls. The ticking seemed louder than usual, like it was trying to tell me something. The bell above the door jingled as another customer entered, but I didn't look up. I had no need for distraction. I wasn't here for anything specific, just wandering, as I often did when I wanted to clear my mind. But then something caught my eye. In the corner of the store, under a pile of old coats, there was a small glass case. It wasn't anything extraordinary at first glance, but something about it made me stop. I stepped closer, the air growing colder as I neared the case. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a watch. It was silver, elegant, with a delicate chain. Its face was cracked, and its hands were frozen in place. I leaned in for a closer look, my breath fogging up the glass. The time on the watch was exact. 10:15. My heart skipped a beat. I don't know why, but that time, the time frozen on that watch, felt wrong. It felt like a piece of me had been torn away, something long lost that had somehow come back. I couldn't explain it, but my mind raced with memories, each one more vivid than the last. It was as if the watch had a pull on me, tugging at something deep inside. I could hear the ticking of the other clocks again, louder now, and yet somehow distant. The noise of the store, the sound of my own breath, all seemed to fade away. The watch's frozen hands kept drawing me in, the seconds stretching between them. 10:15. The bell above the door jingled again, but this time it didn't break my trance. I felt watched, as if someone, or something, was waiting for me to take it and set things in motion again. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the edge of the case. I knew I shouldn't. Something about it, something deep down, told me it wasn't right. But I couldn't help it. Slowly, almost against my will, I reached out and lifted the glass. It was cool to the touch, the metal of the watch cold and smooth. As I held it in my palm, the room around me seemed to shift. The ticking of the clocks grew louder, more insistent. The air felt thicker, heavier. My chest tightened. I looked down at the watch in my hand, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A shadow flickered across the glass. But when I blinked, it was gone. I could feel a chill creeping up my spine. It was as if the time on the watch, 10:15, was a moment frozen in time, a moment that had long ago slipped from my memory, yet was now returning with a force I wasn't prepared for. I turned to walk away, my feet dragging as I moved toward the counter. The bell above the door jingled once more, but this time I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The shopkeeper, a thin woman with graying hair, looked up from the counter as I placed the watch down in front of her. She didn't smile. Instead, she eyed me carefully, her gaze lingering on the watch. "That's an old one," she said softly, almost like she was speaking to herself. "It hasn't worked in years." but it does have a strange pull on people. I frowned. Pull? She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the watch. Some things are meant to stay frozen in time. You should be careful with it. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder if she knew something I didn't. I paid for the watch quickly and left the store, the cool air of the outside world hitting my face. But as I stepped into the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted. Everything felt different. Like the watch had opened a door to something I wasn't ready to understand. I glanced down at the time. 10:15. It was the same time, the same frozen moment. But now, I couldn't ignore the strange sensation creeping over me. What had I just walked into? And what did it mean? The watch felt heavier in my hand, and I knew deep down that I was not leaving this encounter unscathed. Something was waiting, something tied to that moment in time. And I had no idea how close it was getting. The wind picked up as I walked, the chilly gusts swirling around me like whispers in the dark. I clutched the watch in my pocket, the cold metal pressing against my palm. The feeling of unease I had since entering the store didn't fade as I stepped further into the quiet streets. The usual sounds of the city seemed muted, distant, as if I were walking through a dream. The tick-tock of the watch was faint but unmistakable, like an echo inside my head, following me. I tried to focus on the sounds around me, cars passing, distant conversations, the occasional honk, but everything felt too distant. My footsteps were too loud, my breathing too shallow. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was out of place. Something was watching me. I slowed my pace, glancing around nervously. The street lamps flickered above, their light flickering in a way that seemed unnatural. The air felt too still, as though the world had paused for just a moment. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling, but it lingered, cold and heavy. I walked faster, the buildings around me growing taller, more oppressive. It was getting late, and I needed to get home, to shake this unease. But then, as I rounded a corner, I saw something in the distance, just a flicker, a shadow moving across the street. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped in my tracks. It was only a moment, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. The shadow didn't belong. It was too tall, too unnatural. I stared, but it was already gone, vanishing into the alleyway. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I turned quickly, hurrying toward my apartment, but the feeling of being followed was growing stronger. Every street lamp I passed seemed to flicker as I walked beneath it, as though something was draining the light from the world around me. I glanced over my shoulder again, but the street behind me was empty. The watch, still in my pocket, felt heavier than before. The tick-tock was louder now, as though it were coming from inside my chest. I rushed up the stairs to my apartment, fumbling with my keys. As I entered, I locked the door behind me, but the strange sensation didn't fade. It followed me inside, wrapping around me like a cold fog. I sat down at my kitchen table, staring at the watch in my hand. The face was still cracked, the hand still frozen at 10:15. The more I stared at it, the more I felt something pulling at my mind. I tried to focus, but the more I thought about it, the more fragmented my thoughts became. It was as if the watch had opened a door in my memory, one that I wasn't prepared to walk through. I closed my eyes, trying to shake the feeling. And then, the sound of ticking grew louder. It started soft, barely a whisper, but then it grew louder and louder until it was all I could hear. The walls seemed to vibrate with the noise. My heart raced in my chest, and I opened my eyes. Nothing had changed. The room was the same. The air was still. But the sound of the ticking, coming from everywhere, was overwhelming. I stood up quickly, knocking over my chair in the process. The ticking continued, louder now, like the time itself was closing in on me. My pulse quickened. I rushed to the living room, trying to escape the sound, but it followed me, growing even more intense. Then, I froze. In the far corner of the room, next to the window, a shadow began to form. It was thin at first, but it stretched, growing longer and more defined. I stepped back, my breath coming in short gasps. The shadow wasn't just a shadow. It had shape. It had movement. It began to shift and sway, as if something were standing there, unseen but waiting. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, unable to look away. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The shadow seemed to shift, step forward, and suddenly, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I stood there, frozen in place, my hands trembling. The ticking had stopped. For a moment, I didn't know if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. The room was silent now, unnervingly so. But I could still feel it. That lingering presence. The feeling that I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure what I had seen, if it had been a shadow, a trick of the light, or something else. But the unease was too real. The silence too thick. I looked down at the watch in my hand again. 10:15. Was that the time? Was it the same moment? Was it trying to tell me something? The questions flooded my mind, but the answers were always just out of reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that the watch had triggered something. Something that was now watching me. Something I couldn't escape. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the presence was there, just waiting. And I knew deep down it wasn't going away. The silence was deafening, and I could feel it closing in. I couldn't stay still any longer. The silence in my apartment felt suffocating. I needed air. I needed to move, to get away from the weight of the ticking that seemed to echo in my mind, relentless and unforgiving. But no matter how far I went, the shadow, the presence, was there, lurking in the corners of my thoughts. I grabbed my jacket and hurried out of the apartment, the cold air outside hitting my face like a splash of water. The streets were eerily quiet, too quiet. There was no one around, no cars, no pedestrians, just the faint hum of the city in the distance. It felt as though I had stepped into another world, one where time had stopped. The watch. I pulled it from my pocket and held it in my hand, feeling its cold, smooth surface. 10:15. The time felt wrong. The same time from the store, the same time frozen in that moment. I glanced around, half expecting to see the shadow again, the one that had followed me into my apartment. But the streets were empty. Nothing moved, and yet I could feel the air growing thick, heavier with each passing second. I needed answers. I had to know what was happening, why this watch had such a strange hold on me. My feet moved on their own as I walked down the street, past the rows of old buildings that looked so familiar, yet now felt like they belonged to another world. I turned a corner, heading toward the park. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying in the wind like skeletal hands reaching out for me. The park was deserted, save for a few stray leaves tumbling across the path. I sat down on one of the benches, staring at the watch in my hand. It felt like it was alive, as if it were breathing with me, its presence growing stronger the longer I held it. The sound of my heartbeat in my ears drowned out everything else. I closed my eyes, trying to clear my mind, but it was useless. The past few hours had been a blur of confusion, fear, and uncertainty. The shadow, the ticking, the strange pull I felt toward the watch, it was all too much. And then, I heard it. A soft rustling, barely audible, but there nonetheless. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My eyes snapped open, scanning the empty park. There was nothing there. The trees, the benches, the path, all empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The rustling grew louder, closer. I turned to look over my shoulder, my pulse quickening. My breath caught in my throat as I saw something moving behind the trees. A figure, tall and thin, was emerging from the shadows. It didn't look human, its shape was wrong, too long, too twisted. I blinked, and it was gone. I stood up quickly, the watch still clutched tightly in my hand. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared, but the feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. The shadows in the park seemed to stretch and warp around me, as though they were alive, as though they were closing in. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from whatever this was. But the moment I turned to run, the air seemed to shift, and the world around me froze. The park, the trees, the bench, all of it stood still, like a painting suspended in time. I looked down at the watch in my hand. 10:15. The watch, the time, it was like it had captured me, pulled me into its moment. The world around me no longer made sense. The ticking was back, louder now, deafening. It filled my ears, my mind, until I thought I might lose control. And then, I felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, touched my shoulder. I froze, my body locked in place, unable to move, unable to scream. The hand wasn't real, it couldn't be. But I could feel it, its weight, its icy grip. I slowly turned, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. No one behind me. But I could still feel the cold hand on my shoulder, pressing into me, pulling me in. I gasped for breath, struggling to break free from whatever this was. But the more I fought, the tighter the grip became. The sound of ticking filled the air, louder now, impossibly loud. It was no longer just coming from the watch, it was coming from everywhere. The trees, the ground, the very air itself seemed to pulse with the sound. And then, the hand released. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground, gasping for air. My eyes darted around, searching for anything that could explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. The park was still frozen, the trees unmoving. It was as if the world had come to a halt. I looked down at the watch again. 10:15. The watch was no longer just an object in my hand. It was a key, a force that controlled time itself, a force that had pulled me into its world and left me stranded. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't escape it. The ticking was growing louder, louder still, until it drowned everything else out. The shadow in the park, the cold hand on my shoulder, the strange pull toward the watch, it was all part of something much larger, something I wasn't prepared to face. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. The world was still frozen, the ticking still reverberating through the air. And I knew, deep down, that I had crossed a point of no return. Whatever was waiting for me, whatever was tied to that moment in time, it was coming for me. And there was nowhere left to hide. The frozen world around me remained unnaturally still. The rustling of the leaves, the distant hum of the city, it was as if everything had slipped into silence, leaving only the relentless ticking of the watch. My heart hammered in my chest, and every breath felt like it could be my last. The shadowy figure, the cold hand on my shoulder, they were still etched into my mind, like fragments of a nightmare that wouldn't let go. I stood in the park, my body stiff with fear, and yet the world remained motionless. There was no sound except the ticking. It was the only thing that made sense now, the only constant in this eerie stillness. But I couldn't escape it. It was inside me, in my thoughts, pulling me deeper into its grip. I glanced at the watch in my hand once more. 10:15. The time seemed to pulse on its cracked face, as though it were alive. As though it were waiting. The longer I stood there, the more the feeling of dread grew. It wasn't just the strange quiet, the unnatural stillness, it was something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I could feel something moving, something shifting just beyond my reach. It was there, right in the periphery of my vision, but when I turned to face it, it was gone. A flicker. A whisper. A change. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to move. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the frozen ground. The streets were empty, the buildings towering over me like silent sentinels. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see the shadow following, but there was nothing. Just the same empty streets, the same eerie stillness. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away from the park, away from the watch, away from whatever this force was that had invaded my world. I needed to make sense of it, to understand it. But every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't escape. I reached the entrance of the subway station, its iron doors looming ahead like the entrance to another world. The lights flickered overhead, and I hesitated. The shadows in the corner of my vision flickered, stretching unnaturally long. I could feel the cold hand again, that strange grip, but I didn't dare look back. Without thinking, I stepped inside the station. The clatter of the trains in the distance echoed through the tunnels, but even the sounds felt wrong, distorted, as if the entire world were being filtered through something I couldn't comprehend. The familiar hum of the trains felt off, too far away, too distant, as though I were walking through a memory of the city, not the city itself. I walked down the stairs to the platform, the walls closing in around me. The subway station had never seemed so empty, so suffocating. I could feel the air growing colder, the silence pressing against me, threatening to crush me under its weight. The watch. I pulled it from my pocket, my fingers trembling as I held it in my hand. 10:15. The hands were frozen, unmoving, but the presence around me seemed to shift. I could feel it now, close, as if it were breathing down my neck. Suddenly, I heard it again, the rustling. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping in my chest. There was nothing there. But the rustling continued, closer now. I could hear the shuffle of footsteps, soft but deliberate, dragging across the cold floor of the subway platform. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen. The footsteps were growing louder, more distinct. They were following me, closing in with every passing second. I turned back toward the tunnel. The lights overhead flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The sound of the footsteps stopped. Then, the ticking. It was louder now, pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. The sound was no longer just from the watch, it was everywhere, emanating from the walls, the floors, the air itself. My chest tightened as the sound filled the space, growing louder and faster. The train tracks stretched out before me, empty and dark. I was not alone. I knew that now. I glanced down at the watch. 10:15. The time. I had to leave. I had to escape. But the world around me was closing in, the shadows lengthening, the sound of the ticking unbearable. And then it came. A figure, tall and thin, emerged from the darkness of the tunnel. The figure seemed to shift, its form flickering like a mirage, flickering between the shadows and the light. I could see it clearly now, its limbs too long, its shape twisted in ways that didn't make sense. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I stared into its face, or where a face should have been, and I felt the same coldness I had felt in the park. That same unholy chill. The figure stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw its eyes. Empty. Hollow. Black as the void. It was waiting. The ticking of the watch had stopped. And then, in one swift motion, the figure reached out toward me. I could feel its cold, skeletal fingers brushing my skin, and in that moment, time itself seemed to break. The moment stretched on forever. The cold fingers gripped my arm, sending a shock of ice through my veins. My breath caught in my throat as the figure loomed closer, its empty eyes fixated on mine, pulling me in like a void, swallowing all sense of reality. Time felt distorted, stretched into an eternity that was neither past nor future, but an endless present where nothing moved except the sound of my racing heart. I tried to pull away, but my body was paralyzed, frozen in place by the weight of the moment. The world around me seemed to bend and warp as though reality itself was starting to unravel. The shadows that had been stretched across the subway platform now danced and flickered, twisting in strange angles, as if they were alive, mocking me. And then, the ticking started again. Louder. It filled the space with its maddening rhythm, a constant reminder of the moment I couldn't escape. I could feel the watch still clenched in my hand, but it was different now. It no longer felt like an object. It felt like the pulse of the world itself, like time was inside me, choking me. The figure's hand moved slowly, almost leisurely, and as it touched my chest, I felt the world tilt, my body unable to keep up with the shift. The temperature dropped. The air around me became thick, suffocating, and in that moment, I felt as if I were standing at the very edge of reality, where the line between life and death blurred into a single, unfathomable point. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg for this to stop, to run away from this nightmare. But the more I fought, the more the shadows pressed in on me. The space between the walls seemed to narrow, and I felt the weight of the universe itself closing in, suffocating me. It was the time. It was the watch. The thought pierced through my mind like a cold blade. The time had trapped me. 10:15. The moment had arrived, and it had been waiting for me all along, its tendrils reaching into my past, into my memory. But why? What did this moment mean? What was it about 10:15 that had brought me here, to this moment, with this creature, this thing that wasn't quite human, yet not entirely inhuman? I tried to focus, to make sense of it all. The watch. The time. The shadows. The figure. I forced myself to take a deep breath, steadying my pulse, trying to regain control. The figure's hand was still pressed against my chest, cold and unyielding, but something inside me stirred. The shadows. The ticking. The time itself, it had a rhythm, a pattern. It wasn't just random. It wasn't just happening by chance. There was something I had missed, something I had to understand, something buried deep within me. I closed my eyes, pushing the terror aside, focusing only on the sound of the ticking. It wasn't just noise. It was a message, a language, a pulse. It was the heartbeat of the universe itself, and I had to listen. I had to find the thread that connected me to it. The figure loomed over me, its dark form flickering like a shadow in a dream, but as I tuned into the rhythm of the ticking, the world around me started to shift. The shadows began to pull back, the walls of the subway station no longer closing in on me, but fading into the background like a fading memory. The figure wavered, as if it were losing its form, dissolving into the air itself. And then, in the silence that followed, I understood. The watch had stopped time. It had taken me to a place beyond time, where moments collided, where past and future blended into a single instant. I wasn't just facing the figure. I was facing my own past, my own regrets, my own fears. The watch had brought me to this moment not to escape, but to confront. The figure wasn't a monster. It was a reflection. A part of me that I had locked away for years. I felt the grip on my chest loosen, and for the first time, I could move again. I took a step back, the figure's presence receding into the shadows. The watch in my hand began to pulse, its hands starting to move again, but now they were moving slowly, methodically, like the unfolding of an old story. 10:15. The time had come. The moment had arrived. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I looked down at the watch, its ticking now steady, its hands moving in the direction of the future. The figure had gone, but the shadows remained, flickering at the edges of my vision. Time was still with me, and yet it no longer had the power to control me. I could feel the weight lifting from my chest, and as I stood there in the silent subway station, I understood one thing: I had been running from myself. From the past. From the memories I had tried to bury. But now, I was free. The watch wasn't a prison. It was a key. And I had finally unlocked it. The shadows that had once haunted me faded, leaving only the quiet, steady pulse of time. And I walked forward, no longer afraid of what lay ahead, knowing that the past was behind me and that the future was mine to create. The ticking continued, but now it was a reminder, not of the weight of time, but of its endless possibility. The moment was over, and I was free. Have you ever found something that felt wrong, but you couldn't explain why? Something that seemed familiar, yet out of place? That's what happened to me one autumn afternoon, walking down a quiet street I'd walked 1,000 times before. It was just after a light drizzle had passed, and the air smelled fresh, cool with that damp, earthy scent that follows rain. The streets were wet, the pavement glistening under the weak sun, and the world seemed to be taking a deep breath, as if it had just been reborn. I was heading home after work, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I was tired from the grind of the week, tired from the endless routine of life that had started to feel more like a loop than a path forward. But that's when I saw it. An umbrella. A black, ordinary umbrella, abandoned on the sidewalk. It was strange because, in all my years of walking this same route, I had never seen it before. It lay there, discarded, as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. Nothing particularly remarkable about it, except for the initials on the handle. My initials. I stopped in my tracks. The initials weren't identical, but they were close enough, just a few letters off. Enough to make my heart skip a beat. I knelt down and examined it more closely, my fingers brushing over the worn leather handle. It had clearly been used, the fabric frayed in places, the metal ribs slightly bent as if it had weathered a storm or two. But why was it here? Why did it have my initials? My mind raced, but I couldn't come up with any logical reason. It was too strange to be a coincidence. I briefly wondered if someone had left it for me on purpose, but who would do such a thing? I hadn't told anyone my initials, not in years. I hesitated for a moment. I knew I should keep walking, mind my own business, but something about the umbrella seemed to call to me. It felt significant, like it was waiting for me. I picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the handle, I felt a strange shiver run up my spine, like a current of cold electricity had passed through me. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching, but the street was empty. Just the distant hum of traffic, the faint murmur of the city's life carrying on. I looked at the umbrella in my hand again. It was just a weathered object, wasn't it? Nothing more. Yet, something felt wrong, like I was holding onto a key that didn't belong to any door I knew. I decided to take it with me. The rain had stopped by the time I reached my apartment building. I tucked the umbrella under my arm as I stepped into the lobby, my mind still whirling with questions. What were the chances of finding something like that? I wasn't superstitious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this umbrella than met the eye. I stepped into the elevator, the familiar scent of wood and metal filling the small space. The doors closed, and I pressed the button for my floor, the soft hum of the elevator carrying me upwards. I didn't know it then, but I had just picked up something that would change everything. As the elevator ascended, I looked down at the umbrella in my hands once more. And that's when I noticed it, the faint, almost imperceptible markings on the fabric. A small tear in the side, where the seam had pulled loose, and something dark and reddish-brown staining the tip. The elevator slowed, and I stared at the stain, the unease that had been lingering at the back of my mind suddenly growing stronger. It was almost like the umbrella was trying to tell me something, but the message wasn't clear. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just an umbrella, after all. The elevator dinged softly as it reached my floor. I stepped out, my apartment just a few doors down. I made my way to my door, keys in hand, and as I unlocked it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and set the umbrella by the coat rack. The day had been long, and the last thing I wanted was to let my mind wander further into the mystery of that umbrella. I had bigger things to worry about: work, bills, life. But as I took off my coat and began to make my way to the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of it from the corner of my eye. The umbrella. It was no longer lying where I had left it. It was standing upright, perfectly balanced, right in the center of the hallway. I froze. Ow! I hadn't placed it like that. I had simply left it leaning against the wall. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I stepped closer, my footsteps heavy on the floor. The umbrella was still and silent, as if it had been waiting for me. There was no one else in the apartment. I was sure of it. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and touched the handle. But this time, there was no strange electrical shock. No coldness. It felt normal. Ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as if the umbrella itself was somehow aware of me, of my every move. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for bed, but my thoughts were racing too fast for sleep. I knew that somehow, I couldn't let go of this strange little object that had appeared in my life, as if by fate. But what did it want from me? And more importantly, what would happen when the rain returned. But little did I know, the answers to those questions would come sooner than I expected. The days passed quietly, but the unease never quite left me. The umbrella sat by the door, a constant reminder of that strange encounter. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, just an odd coincidence. But every time I glanced at it, I felt a slight tightening in my chest, as if the umbrella were waiting for something, anticipating an event I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't until 4 days later that the weather changed. I woke up to the distant sound of thunder rumbling in the sky, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The air was thick with humidity, and I could feel the storm approaching, almost like it was breathing down my neck. By the time I left the apartment to head out for work, the first few drops of rain had begun to fall. I walked quickly, my jacket pulled tight around my shoulders as the wind picked up. The rain was light at first, just a drizzle that made the streets shimmer with reflections of the world above. But by the time I reached the bus stop, the drizzle had turned into a downpour. I dug into my bag for my old umbrella, the one I usually carried, but it wasn't there. I cursed under my breath, realizing I must have forgotten it at home. My only option was to stand there, getting soaked as the rain came down harder, the droplets stinging against my skin. That's why I remembered the umbrella by the door. The one with my initials. I turned on my heel, heading back toward my building, the storm crashing down around me. It wasn't just rain anymore, it was as if the sky had opened up, pouring water with such intensity that I could barely see past the streetlights. The wind was pushing me forward, urging me to go back, to retrieve that umbrella. By the time I reached my apartment building again, I was drenched, the cold rain cutting through my clothes. I burst into the lobby, my eyes scanning for the umbrella, and there it was, just where I had left it, leaning against the wall. I grabbed it without hesitation, the familiar handle cool in my grip. As I opened it, I felt an odd sense of relief. The umbrella was like a shield against the storm outside, but also, somehow, against something I couldn't quite name. I walked back out into the downpour, holding it above me as the rain pounded the streets. The storm had intensified, and with every step, I felt a strange weight pressing against me, as if the storm were more than just weather. It felt deliberate, as if it were trying to overwhelm me. But with the umbrella above me, I felt a strange sense of protection, a small bubble of calm amidst the chaos of the storm. But that was when I noticed it. The sound. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a low, almost inaudible scraping sound beneath the rumble of thunder and the roar of the wind. But as I walked, the sound grew clearer. It was a soft, dragging sound, like something, or someone, was following me. I turned quickly, scanning the empty street behind me, but there was no one there. No figure in the rain. No footsteps. Just the relentless downpour. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was probably just the wind, playing tricks on me. But as I continued walking, the sound followed, closer now, almost at my heels. My breath quickened. My heart began to race, and I quickened my pace. The umbrella above me provided little comfort now, as the scraping grew louder, more deliberate. I felt a chill spread across my skin, the kind of cold that wasn't from the rain. I looked behind me again, this time my eyes searching the shadows, the flickering streetlights casting strange shapes along the wet pavement. There was nothing. No one. And yet, I still felt it, an undeniable presence, something close, but unseen. The storm intensified, the wind howling like a warning, as the sound grew even louder, like someone, or something, was right behind me. My steps quickened to a near run, but no matter how fast I moved, the scraping was always just a step away, closing in on me. I reached a narrow alley, the kind of place I normally would have avoided, but in my panic, I didn't care. The alley was dark, with only the faint glow of distant streetlights casting long shadows on the walls. The rain hammered down, the sound of the storm almost deafening. I turned into the alley, hoping for some shelter, hoping to lose whatever was following me. But the scraping was still there, relentless, as if the very air around me had become thick with something sinister. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the alley, cloaked in the mist of the storm. It was tall, its face obscured by the shadows, its hands hidden in the folds of its dark coat. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure, unable to move, unable to speak. It didn't move at first, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, pulling at me, urging me to come closer. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't being followed. I was being led. The umbrella in my hand trembled, as if it were responding to the figure's presence. It felt heavier now, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. My pulse raced, and I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. The figure stepped forward, and the scraping sound stopped. "Why?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, watching me, as the rain continued to pour. The umbrella was the only thing between us, the only barrier between the ordinary world I knew and whatever dark force had drawn me here. The storm raged on, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The figure took another step forward, and I knew then that whatever was about to happen, I couldn't escape it. The umbrella flickered. And then, with a gust of wind, it snapped shut. The umbrella snapped shut with an almost unnatural force, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The storm raged around me, but in that instant, everything fell silent. The wind stopped howling. The rain slowed to a gentle trickle, as if the storm itself had paused, waiting for something. I stood frozen, staring at the figure at the end of the alley. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct told me to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, piercing, unblinking. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked onto the shadowed form, unable to break free. And then, something shifted. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the alley, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to reverberate through the very air around me. But when I looked down at the ground, there were no footprints. The rain, which had briefly stopped, had resumed, yet the footsteps remained. A chill ran through me, and it wasn't from the cold of the rain. It was something else, something deeper. The umbrella in my hand was trembling again, as if reacting to the unseen presence in the alley. The figure's form began to distort, the shadows around it shifting and bending unnaturally. It was as if it was no longer just a person, but something more, a presence that had no physical form, but existed nonetheless. I could almost see its outline changing, flickering like a bad film reel. The footsteps grew louder, but they weren't from the figure. No. These steps were coming from somewhere else, behind me, from deeper within the alley. It was as if something else, something hidden, was approaching. I turned quickly, my heart skipping a beat. My eyes scanned the alley, but there was nothing. The streetlights were barely visible now, their glow dimmed by the heavy mist that had crept in. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The footsteps grew closer, and I felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to flee. My body was no longer my own. It was as if something was controlling me, pushing me forward, urging me to escape. but my legs wouldn't move. My hand still gripped the umbrella, even as it continued to tremble in my grip. The figure took another step toward me, its presence growing stronger, darker. I could feel it now, its weight pressing down on me, pushing me into the shadows. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was caught in my throat. And then, in a flash of movement, the figure was gone. I blinked, disoriented, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. But the footsteps behind me were still there, the scraping sound returning, louder this time. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, a force moving in the darkness. I could feel it creeping closer, something reaching for me, something that shouldn't exist. The umbrella flickered again, and I felt the weight of it shift in my hand. I looked down, and in that instant, I saw something strange. The fabric of the umbrella was changing. The familiar black cloth had started to darken, to bleed into deeper shades of red. The tips of the spokes gleamed with something unnatural, glinting in the faint light. My grip tightened involuntarily, and I could hear the faintest whisper, as though the umbrella was speaking to me, urging me forward. The footsteps were almost on top of me now, the sound unmistakable, unmistakably close. I turned again, this time with more urgency, and my eyes locked onto someone standing at the far end of the alley. The mist had thickened, and the figure was barely visible, just a shadow among shadows. But it was there. It was always there. A voice, soft, almost inaudible, rose from the depths of my mind. It's time. The words weren't mine. They didn't come from the figure. They were something else, something deeper, pulling me into its web. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then, as if from nowhere, a hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing my wrist with inhuman strength. It was cold, impossibly cold, and the grip sent a shock of ice through my entire body. I gasped, trying to pull away, but the hand wouldn't release me. The pressure increased, as if the grip were digging into my very soul. The umbrella quivered again in my grasp, and I realized it was no longer just an object. It had become a part of the darkness, a link to whatever force had trapped me here. And it was pulling me in. Leave it behind. The voice whispered again, this time louder, clearer. Leave it behind or be consumed. I didn't understand. The umbrella was mine. It had come to me for a reason, hadn't it? It had been left for me, as if it had known this moment would come. But the grip on my wrist tightened, and the darkness around me grew deeper, colder. My mind screamed for escape. My legs, frozen with terror, wouldn't move. The umbrella felt heavier, and I could hear the wind picking up again, this time with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very ground beneath me. Leave it behind. The voice urged one final time, but this time there was an edge to it, something primal, something desperate. With all the strength I had left, I twisted my wrist, breaking free from the icy grip, and stumbled backward. The umbrella dropped from my hands. And then, as if on cue, the figure vanished. The alley was still, deathly still. The sound of the storm had dulled, the rain now just a whisper against the pavement. The figure, the presence, had retreated into the shadows from which it came. I stood there for a moment, my body trembling, my mind reeling. The umbrella lay on the ground in front of me, its black fabric now a deep crimson, shimmering in the fading light. I reached for it again. As my fingers brushed against the umbrella's handle, a sudden surge of panic swept through me. I froze, my hand hovering just above it, uncertain. The feeling that had been creeping up on me, the sensation that this object was no longer a simple tool, but something far more dangerous rushed back into my mind. I had to choose. I glanced around, the alley empty, save for the puddles reflecting the dim light. The storm had lessened, but the air still felt thick, oppressive. The umbrella, my umbrella, lay at my feet, its form now an unsettling shade of crimson, like a warning I couldn't ignore. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain. A deep, gnawing pull to take it. It was as if it were calling me, beckoning me to reach out and take it once more. And yet, I could feel that same cold presence lingering, like a shadow that wouldn't quite leave. I stepped back, my breath quickening. The hand that had gripped my wrist still felt as if it had left its mark, the coldness still running through my veins. I knew, instinctively, that whatever force had tried to claim me had been tied to this umbrella. It wasn't just a forgotten object, it was something alive, something aware. I looked down at it again. The crimson fabric seemed to shimmer, almost as if it were moving, the edges rippling in the faint breeze. I could almost hear it whispering to me. Take it. Take what is yours. The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. The umbrella, or whatever it was now, was calling to me, pulling me in like a magnet. I took a shaky breath and stepped back once more. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. If I took the umbrella again, what would happen? What had happened to the person who had left it behind? The thought of the figure in the alley, that shadowed presence, lingered in my mind. The way it had disappeared, as if it had never existed in the first place, but had left something behind. A part of itself. If I left the umbrella, what would follow me? What consequences would I face for abandoning it now, when it had already made its intentions so clear? But I couldn't stay here. I couldn't remain in this twisted, in-between place forever. I bent down, slowly, cautiously. My fingers brushed against the handle once again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I gripped it tightly, as if it had finally accepted me, as if I had no choice but to take it. The instant I touched the umbrella, a sharp jolt ran through me, electric, searing, as if the umbrella had recognized me. My fingers tightened around the handle, and I could feel the energy coursing through me, flowing through my entire body. It wasn't just the umbrella that had changed. It was me. The world around me flickered, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The alley blurred at the edges, like I was looking through a fogged window, the lights above me dimming until only the umbrella stood out in sharp contrast. Its crimson fabric seemed to pulse, alive with some unseen force. I could hear it now, not in whispers, but in a voice that filled my mind. You are mine now. You are part of the storm. I dropped the umbrella, stumbling backward as the voice echoed inside my skull. My chest tightened, and the air became suffocating. I couldn't breathe. The world around me was spinning, as if I were being pulled into something deep, something vast. I could hear the sound of rushing wind again, but it wasn't the wind of a storm, it was something else. Something more unnatural, as if the very air had begun to shift, to breathe with a will of its own. The voice inside me grew louder, the words now clear, commanding. There is no going back. And then, before I could react, the shadows around me moved. They were alive, swirling in unnatural patterns, stretching toward me like tendrils. They twisted and coiled, enveloping me, pulling me in closer to the very thing that had once seemed like nothing more than a simple object. I tried to move, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The grip around me tightened, the air colder than I had ever felt before. My heart raced, and panic surged within me, but I couldn't escape. I couldn't break free. The umbrella, abandoned just moments ago, was now the source of my terror. It seemed to command the darkness, to draw it in like a magnetic force. And no matter how hard I struggled, no matter how much I tried to fight, the shadows only grew stronger. "You are part of the storm now," the voice repeated, louder, more insistent. I could feel my body trembling, my mind on the brink of breaking. The coldness spread through me until I felt nothing but the weight of the umbrella in my hand, the pressure of the shadows closing in. And then the whispers stopped. The wind stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. I could feel it. The calm before the final, inevitable storm. But I didn't have to face it alone. The umbrella in my hand seemed to pulse again, its crimson fabric swirling in my grip. And then, through the silence, I heard something else. A voice different from the one that had tormented me, soft and distant. "It's not too late." My pulse slowed, and the darkness seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if caught in a tug-of-war between two forces. The shadows around me trembled. I closed my eyes, clutching the umbrella tighter, and whispered, almost to myself, "I can still leave." And that's when I felt it, the shift. The presence that had once been suffocating, oppressive, now felt lighter, as if something had loosened its grip on me. The shadows recoiled. The umbrella was mine to control. I opened my eyes, and the alley around me was no longer suffocating. The mist had cleared, the rain lightened, and the street lights above were flickering back to life. I stood there, trembling, but I wasn't alone anymore. The umbrella had chosen me. The alley was quiet now, eerily so. The thick fog had lifted, leaving only the soft pitter-patter of rain against the pavement. The shadows that had once seemed to move with malicious intent were now still, as if the storm within me had passed. But I knew better. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The umbrella still pulsed in my hand, its crimson fabric a constant reminder of the force I now held. I could feel the weight of it, the power that seemed to surge through me. It wasn't just an object anymore, it was a part of me. My connection to it, to the storm, was undeniable. The voice inside my mind, the one that had whispered threats and promises, had gone silent. But its presence lingered, like an echo in the back of my thoughts. I could still feel its influence, faint but persistent. "You are the storm," it whispered once more, as if reaffirming its claim over me. I took a step forward, testing the air around me. The street, which had once felt familiar, now seemed strange, foreign. The very ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if I were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. The street lights above flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows that twisted and danced in the growing darkness. I wanted to leave. I wanted to forget everything that had happened, to run as far away from this cursed umbrella as I could. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't that simple. I couldn't escape it. It had already claimed me. I raised the umbrella, its crimson fabric unfolding with a fluid motion. As I did, I could feel the storm within me stir, a restlessness that mirrored the growing tension in the air. The winds were picking up again, but this time it wasn't just the weather. The storm was inside me now, swirling with a power I couldn't fully understand. The first drop of rain hit the ground, followed by another and another. The sky above darkened, the clouds swirling in unnatural patterns. The storm was returning, and it was no longer just an external force. It was mine to control. I could hear the distant rumble of thunder, the first warning of the chaos to come. But this time, I wasn't afraid. In fact, I welcomed it. The storm wasn't my enemy, it was part of me, and I was ready to face whatever came next. As the rain began to pour, heavier this time, the streets around me seemed to transform. The buildings blurred in the downpour, their outlines shifting and warping as though they were part of the storm itself. The alley that had once seemed so ordinary now looked like a different world entirely, a world where nothing was as it seemed. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, focusing on the umbrella in my hands. I could feel the energy building inside me, a force I had never known, a power that had always been there, waiting to be awakened. The storm responded to me as if it had been waiting for this moment, for me to embrace it. And then, with a force that took me by surprise, the wind howled around me, lifting the umbrella higher into the air. The world seemed to spin, the rain now a torrential force, battering the streets and the buildings, but I stood firm. The umbrella, crimson and alive, was my anchor. The whispers in my mind returned, louder this time, almost frantic. You are the storm. You are the one who controls it. I opened my eyes, and the alley before me seemed to shift, the shadows pulling back, as if they were afraid of the power I now commanded. The rain lashed around me, but I didn't flinch. I could feel it, my power. It was in the wind, the rain, the very air itself. And then, for the first time, I understood the truth of it all. The umbrella had been left for me, not by some unknown hand, but by something far greater. It had been a gift, a calling. It was meant for me to find, meant for me to wield. The storm had always been a part of me, waiting for me to realize it. I wasn't just holding the umbrella. I was the umbrella. I was the storm. And as I stood there, in the heart of the rain, I felt something shift inside me. The power that had once terrified me now felt familiar. The storm wasn't something to fear, it was a part of who I was. A part of what I was meant to become. I took one final, steady breath and closed my eyes, letting the storm wash over me. The thunder rumbled, the rain poured, and the world around me seemed to tremble with the force of it. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because now, I was the one in control. Have you ever received a message from someone you thought was gone forever? I had. And it happened on a night I'll never forget. It was just past midnight when I felt my phone buzz on the nightstand beside me. The light from the screen illuminated the dark room, casting long shadows across the walls. My heart skipped a beat. I was half awake, my mind foggy from sleep, yet something in the air felt off. I reached for my phone, expecting to see a friend's late-night text or an email from work, something ordinary. But it wasn't. The message was from an old contact I had deleted months ago, David. David. A name that once meant everything to me. He had been my best friend, and something more, until he suddenly disappeared from my life without a trace. I had tried to reach out to him countless times, but every attempt had been met with silence. He vanished without a word, leaving behind only confusion and a deep, aching emptiness. The message simply read, "Careful." No explanation. No context. Just those two words, sitting on my screen like a chill running down my spine. My fingers hovered over the phone, unsure what to do. My breath quickened, the room seeming to grow colder around me. It didn't make sense. Why would David, of all people, send me a message after all this time? And why now? I stared at the screen, the notification still glowing in the dark, as though it were daring me to reply, to ask more. But I didn't. I couldn't. My heart raced in my chest, and my mind was swirling. My fingers trembled as I set the phone down on the nightstand and sat up in bed. I tried to tell myself it was a mistake, some weird glitch, a random number, anything but David. But deep down, I knew it was him. The message carried that unmistakable weight, the kind only he could put into words, a feeling I had once been familiar with. But there was something different about this message. It felt like a warning. As I lay back down, my mind kept racing. Careful. That one word echoed in my head, looping over and over like a broken record. What was it supposed to mean? What danger was he trying to warn me about? I glanced around the room, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling unfamiliar, as though the shadows had grown longer, more threatening. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. The noise, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive, too loud in the quiet stillness of the night. I reached for my phone again, my thumb hovering over the screen as I debated whether to reply. What would I even say? I opened the chat, expecting to see the usual blank space where messages from David used to be. But this time, there was something different. A new message from him, dated 2 days ago, appeared at the top of the conversation. Don't go outside. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the blood draining from my face. I didn't remember this message. I hadn't seen it before. What did it mean? The air in the room felt thick, stifling, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the cold fingers of dread creeping up my spine. I scanned the room, looking for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. The windows were shut. The door was locked. Nothing had changed since I went to sleep. But something didn't feel right. A faint noise broke the silence. A small rustling, barely audible at first, came from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I froze, straining to listen. It was too quiet. The sound was too soft to be anything normal, and yet it seemed to grow louder the more I focused on it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a car passing by. It was something else. I got up slowly, my feet silent against the floorboards. The message from David, those words, seemed to hang in the air around me, pulling my thoughts in every direction. I had to check. I had to know what was outside. With one last glance at my phone, I stepped toward the door. The hallway beyond was dimly lit by the faint glow of a nightlight near the stairs. The sound was coming from the end of the hallway, near the front door. It was subtle, like something brushing against the wall, scraping softly. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. My hand reached for the doorknob, and the cold metal sent a shock through my fingertips. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. Then, with a slow exhale, I turned the handle and opened the door. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Still. Silent. But the feeling remained. The feeling of being watched. I stepped into the hallway, glancing around. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt thicker here, heavier. The walls seemed to close in, and the floorboards creaked under my feet, amplifying the unsettling silence. I turned toward the stairs, the sound still faint, but somehow, closer now. I could feel it. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the same tightness, the same unease that had gripped me earlier. The same warning that had come from David. Careful. I began to move toward the stairs, my every step slow and deliberate, as though trying to avoid disturbing the quiet that had taken over the house. But the sound, it was closer now. Louder. It was unmistakable. The scrape of something that wasn't supposed to be there. I stopped. My heart was in my throat. What was it? And then, just as I thought I was about to discover the source of the sound, I heard another message ping on my phone. This time, I didn't need to check to know who it was from. David. I opened it, my hand shaking, and read the words that appeared on the screen. Run. I couldn't breathe. The words were like a curse, wrapped in the digital glow of my phone's screen. Run. I looked down the hallway, my mind racing. The sound, whatever it was still there. It hadn't stopped. It wasn't the wind, nor was it just the house settling. Something was moving. I wasn't alone. I glanced at the door behind me. I could bolt the front door and lock myself inside, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was out there, in the hallway, it was already close. It was already here. I stepped back from the stairs, my feet suddenly too heavy to move. My phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another message from David. It's too late. I staggered back, my pulse racing. Was this some kind of twisted prank? No, I had deleted David's contact months ago. No one had his number. He had disappeared, vanished without a trace. So why was he messaging me now? How could he be sending these warnings, these chilling messages when he hadn't been in my life for so long? And yet, everything about this moment felt wrong. Every corner of the house, every shadow, every noise was telling me the same thing. I wasn't alone. I turned around, expecting to see my reflection in the hallway mirror. But instead, I saw something else, a figure standing there, just beyond the glass, too still to be real. A shadow. Tall. Looming. I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. But I could feel its presence, its weight pressing down on the air around me. It was as if the very space between me and the reflection had thickened, the atmosphere growing suffocating. I stumbled backward, eyes locked on the reflection, but the figure was gone. In its place, there was only the empty hallway. No one standing there. No figure in the mirror. I looked away, forcing my mind to focus. It's just a trick of the light. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. I had seen it. I had felt it. My phone buzzed once more. Don't look behind you. I froze. The message was clear. Too clear. I didn't move. My body refused to respond, as though frozen by some invisible force. A thick silence settled over me, and the scraping sound returned, now louder than before, closer than before. There was something there, something coming toward me. I could hear it, the soft shuffle of feet across the floor. The slow, deliberate sound of something, or someone, drawing nearer. I looked up at the hallway mirror again, but this time I didn't see the figure. Instead, the reflection was dark, like a black void, as if the world on the other side of the glass had vanished, leaving only empty space. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and I turned my head, slowly, afraid of what I might see. Nothing. The hallway was empty. But as I exhaled in relief, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A movement. A shadow. It was quick, just a flash at the edge of my vision, but it was enough. I whipped my head toward the sound. There, at the far end of the hallway, I saw it. A figure. Tall, dark, and moving toward me with an unnatural speed. Its features were indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow was no longer just in the reflection. It was real. It was here. And it was coming closer. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as panic set in. The cold, suffocating air from before returned, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I had to move. I had to get away. I turned to my phone, hoping for some answer, some direction, anything. I typed a quick message, "What is happening?" There was no response. The message sat there, unsent, as if the phone itself was refusing to send it. I could hear the footsteps now, unmistakable, loud and clear. Someone was moving toward me, deliberately, slowly. Each step seemed to reverberate through the house, an almost rhythmic pounding in my ears. "Run." I could hear David's voice in my head, faint but clear. "Run." Without thinking, I dashed down the hallway toward the front door. I reached the door, but before I could turn the handle, I froze. I had heard it, the sound of footsteps, but they weren't behind me anymore. They were in front of me, right on the other side of the door. A voice whispered from behind me, "You shouldn't have looked." I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Only the shadows. Only the emptiness of the hallway. I grabbed the door handle again, pulling it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had become locked from the outside, trapping me inside. I could hear the figure now, closer, almost at my back. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and every inch of the house seemed to be closing in on me. I was trapped. The door was locked. The figure was closing in, and there was nowhere to hide. Then, my phone buzzed again. The message from David read, "You looked. Now it's too late." Before I could process it, the air around me shifted. The lights flickered once, then twice, and everything went black. And in the darkness, I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Familiar. "You should have listened." And then, nothing. I don't know how long I stood there in the dark, my heart racing. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath shallow, but there was nothing, no noise, no movement. Just the eerie silence that wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. My eyes were wide, straining to see anything, but the blackness was absolute. I blinked, hoping to adjust to the darkness, but nothing changed. It was as if the world had stopped moving entirely, leaving me suspended in time. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the light flickered back to life. The dim glow of the hallway lamp buzzed and hummed above me, flickering in and out. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone in the dark, desperate to make sense of what had just happened. What's going on? Why can't I see? I typed the message quickly, but before I could send it, my phone screen went black. The familiar buzzing sound came again, but it wasn't from my phone, it was coming from somewhere in the room. The air felt colder now, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I looked around, but there was nothing, only shadows in every corner, creeping along the walls like living things. My skin crawled with the feeling that something was watching me. Waiting. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, louder than anything else. The buzzing sound was growing stronger, more insistent, until it almost sounded like someone whispering my name. "Sarah." I froze. The voice, soft but unmistakable, was coming from somewhere behind me. I whipped around, my heart racing. No one was there. The house was silent again, save for the sound of my shallow breath. I tried to steady myself, telling myself I was just imagining things, but the air around me felt charged, like it was thick with tension. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle again. I had to get out. I had to leave. But when I touched the door, it was warm. Too warm. I pulled my hand back quickly, surprised, but the warmth lingered on my skin. I stepped back, my head spinning. And then, just like that, the buzzing returned. But now, it was louder, clearer, like a voice coming from inside the walls. I felt my pulse quicken, a knot forming in my stomach. "Don't open the door." It was David's voice. Faint, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have listened. It's too late now." I shuddered, my hands trembling. The door wasn't locked anymore, but it felt wrong. Too wrong. I knew that if I opened it, something would be waiting for me on the other side, something that was already too close. I turned back to my phone, frantically tapping the screen, desperate to see something, anything that would explain what was happening. The last message I received flickered on the screen, unreadable, as if the words were shifting and changing before my eyes. "Run. Leave now." I didn't know if it was David's voice or my own thoughts, but it didn't matter. I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to leave. I grabbed my bag, my feet moving almost of their own accord. I turned toward the back door, but before I could reach for the handle, I heard it. The soft sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and growing louder with each passing second. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing, just the dark, empty hallway. The footsteps stopped, leaving only silence in their wake. I pressed my hand to my chest, trying to steady my breath. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. But every part of me was paralyzed. Something was holding me in place. And then, the whisper came again, so close it felt like it was right behind me. "You're not alone." I didn't turn around. I couldn't. But I could feel it. Something was there. Something that wasn't human. And it was getting closer. The lights flickered again, the room dimming and brightening in quick succession, like the house itself was shuddering, caught between two worlds. My phone screen flashed once more, showing only a single message. "It's coming for you." I stared at the words, a chill running down my spine. I didn't know if it was David or something else entirely, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't safe. And there was no escape. The silence stretched for what felt like forever, until it was broken by a loud knock. 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 I froze. My entire body went still, caught in the sound. Knock. Knock. The knock came again, louder this time, as if the person, or thing, on the other side was trying to break through the door. I backed away slowly, my eyes glued to the door as if somehow, if I didn't move, it wouldn't know I was here. The knocking grew louder, the sound echoing through the house, reverberating in my chest, until it became something else entirely, a pounding, a forceful, unrelenting sound. Knock. 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 And then, suddenly, the door slammed open with a deafening bang. The air turned ice cold, and I felt the weight of something press into the room. Something that didn't belong. I turned toward the door, and for the first time, I saw it. A figure, standing in the doorway. But it wasn't human. It was a shadow. A shape that shifted, too fluid to be real, stretching and bending with every breath I took. And it was moving toward me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place as it drew closer, the dark figure reaching for me with hands that weren't hands, only darkness, stretching toward me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I could feel it, its presence, its coldness. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was its face. Or what might have been its face. A blur of shadows, no eyes, no features, just a hollow emptiness. And then, the world went silent. There was no buzzing, no footsteps, no knocking, only silence. And the words from the message flickered in my mind. It's too late. I woke with a start, gasping for breath, my body drenched in cold sweat. My eyes shot open, and for a split second, I thought I was still trapped in the nightmare. But then the reality of the dim room around me hit. The silence was absolute. I sat up, trembling, trying to shake the remnants of fear that clung to my body like a second skin. My phone, still clutched in my hand, lay beside me on the bed. I stared at it for a moment, half expecting it to light up again, to show another message, another warning. But the screen remained dark, still. I hesitated, almost afraid to look. But then, with shaking hands, I turned it on. There was nothing. No messages. No alerts. Nothing from David. Nothing at all. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. For a moment, I thought it was over. That maybe it had all been some terrible dream. Maybe it was just the isolation, the stress, the fear playing tricks on me. But even as I thought that, I could feel the unease creeping back into my chest. Something wasn't right. My eyes flicked to the door, to the hallway beyond. The quiet of the house felt wrong. It was too still. The knocking, the footsteps, the figure, were they real? Or had I imagined them? I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I had to know. I stood up, legs weak beneath me, and stumbled toward the door. Every step felt like an eternity, as if the floor was pushing back against me, unwilling to let me leave. I reached the door, my hand hovering over the handle. My heart pounded, and for a moment, I almost backed away. But I knew I couldn't. I couldn't let the fear win. I opened the door. The hallway stretched out before me, eerily quiet. The dim light from the hallway lamp flickered faintly, casting long shadows along the walls. Nothing seemed out of place. But it all felt off, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps tentative, each one sending a shiver up my spine. I moved toward the stairs, but before I could reach them, a sound echoed through the house. A soft, familiar buzz. My heart skipped a beat, and I pulled out my phone again, almost afraid to look. The message was waiting for me. It's not over. My breath caught in my throat. The words were simple, chilling, and they sent a wave of dread crashing over me. I looked around, but the hallway was still empty. No figures. No shadows. Just the oppressive quiet. I turned back to the screen, my hands now trembling uncontrollably. Leave. It's coming. I didn't need to be told again. I turned on my heel, my feet moving faster now, toward the back door. The one that led outside. The one that might be my only chance. But then, another buzz. I paused, looking down at the screen, already knowing what it would say. You should have listened. Before I could even react, the temperature in the room dropped. The air became thick, heavy with an unnatural chill that made my skin prickle. I felt a presence, something close, something just behind me. The door to the back hallway slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house, and I spun around in a panic. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was the figure. It was no longer a shadow. It was something more. Something darker. Its features twisted and contorted, no longer indistinct but clearly wrong, like a human figure that had been stretched and distorted beyond recognition. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were empty sockets, hollow and staring. It didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The world around me felt as though it was warping, bending under the weight of its presence. The figure loomed, its form shifting ever so slightly with each passing moment. Then, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, but growing louder. The same voice. David's voice. You looked. Now it's too late. The whisper was all around me now, filling the space, drowning out everything else. I could hear the words in my mind, each one wrapping tighter and tighter around my sanity. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The fear had taken hold, freezing me in place. The figure took a step forward, its presence swallowing the space between us. The air grew colder with each movement, as though the very temperature of the room was being drained away, leaving only a void. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I felt my vision blur, my body growing heavier with every second. The whispering voice was now a chorus, 1,000 voices speaking in unison, all of them David's voice, all of them telling me the same thing. You shouldn't have looked. The last thing I saw before the darkness overtook me was the figure's outstretched hand. Its fingers, long and twisted, reaching for me. I felt the cold, unnatural grip closing around my wrist. And then, nothing. I woke up in my bed again, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. It was the same room, the same phone beside me. But this time, something was different. I looked at the screen. The message was still there. It's not over. And as the darkness crept back into the corners of my mind, I realized it would never be over. Have you ever had one of those mornings where everything seems off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's how it felt that day, the day that changed everything. It was just another Wednesday. The sun had barely begun to rise as I got into my car, the engine purring to life beneath me. The route to work was familiar. I had driven it 1,000 times. Same streets, same traffic lights, same bends in the road. I could drive it with my eyes closed, almost. But that morning, something was different. As I approached the usual intersection, I noticed something out of place, orange cones and a large sign announcing detour ahead. I slowed the car, unsure at first, but there was no other option but to follow the new signs. Must be construction, I muttered to myself, feeling an odd sense of irritation build in my chest. I had never liked change, especially in something as mundane as my daily commute. I liked the predictability of my mornings, the comfort of knowing exactly when I would reach my destination. I followed the signs, veering off onto an unfamiliar street, feeling a creeping unease take root. The houses on this road were older, their windows dusty and their yards overgrown. I had never been this way before, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. The farther I went, the quieter it became. There were no other cars on this road. No other sounds either. I glanced at my watch. 10 minutes later than usual. My stomach clenched slightly, a twinge of discomfort nudging at me, but I kept going. The road twisted, taking me deeper into a neighborhood that felt frozen in time. The houses, though unkempt, had a strange charm. I passed one house, then another, each one more isolated than the last. The streetlights above flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. The deeper I drove, the more the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite name. At the end of the road, I came to a clearing. There was a small, abandoned park, overrun with weeds and empty swings swaying in the breeze. A bench sat alone under a large oak tree. I slowed the car, unsure why I had arrived here. It was as though something had drawn me in, as if the detour itself was not an accident. I parked the car on the side of the road and sat there for a moment, staring at the park. The silence around me felt wrong, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Something in the distance caught my eye, at the edge of the park, near the tree. There was an object half buried in the dirt. I couldn't make it out at first, but my curiosity grew. What was it? What was it doing there? I opened the car door, stepped onto the grass, and walked towards it. The closer I got, the more certain I became that I had seen it before, but I couldn't remember where. It was a small, weathered box, the kind you might find in an old attic or forgotten drawer. I knelt down and pulled it free from the soil. The box was surprisingly heavy for its size. It was covered in dust and dirt, but there was something familiar about it, something that made my heart beat a little faster, my breath hitch in my throat. I wiped the grime off the lid, and there, etched into the wood, were my initials. A sharp intake of breath caught in my chest. How? How could this box have my initials? I had never seen it before. Never. I stared at the box in disbelief, the air around me growing colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. No rational reason for how this object could be connected to me. I opened the box. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of a place I didn't recognize, a place I had never been. But somehow, it felt hauntingly familiar. The image was of an old house, surrounded by overgrown trees, the front door ajar. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. How was this possible? My heart raced as I studied the photograph, and then my phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my daze. The screen was blank, no messages, no alerts. Just a flashing icon. But there, at the top of the screen, was something that made my stomach drop. A new location had appeared on the map, one that was far off the usual route I took. The address was the same as the one in the photograph. Without thinking, I started my car again, the engine roaring to life beneath me. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I followed the new route that had appeared on my phone. The road was unfamiliar, but I couldn't ignore the pull, the strange connection to the photograph. I had to know what was waiting for me. And as the day's light faded behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this detour was no accident. The road stretched out before me, darkening as the evening shadows grew longer. The headlights of my car illuminated the path, but something about this place felt different. The trees, towering and thick on either side, seemed to lean in, their branches tangled like skeletal hands reaching out toward me. The air inside the car felt oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was holding something back, waiting for me to make the next move. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. The map on my phone guided me further, taking me through unfamiliar twists and turns. My usual route would have been familiar by now, predictable even, but this felt like I was driving into an entirely different world. The kind of world you only see in dreams or nightmares. I glanced at the clock. The minutes ticked by slowly, but my heart beat faster with each one. This house, wherever it was, felt like something I had to see, something I had no choice but to find. The road grew narrower, almost impossibly so, until my car was squeezed between overgrown hedges. I barely fit, but I couldn't stop now. I had to go forward. The photograph in my hand felt heavier, more real with each passing second, as if it were pulling me along with it, as if it knew the way better than I did. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape in the distance. The house. At first, I couldn't believe it. There it stood, just as it had in the photograph, a dilapidated old house, its windows dark like empty eyes staring back at me. The door was ajar, just like in the picture, but there was something different about it now. Something more alive. I stopped the car, my breath catching in my throat. The house was even older than I had imagined, its wood warped and weathered by time. The yard was overgrown with weeds, the grass wild and untamed, as if it had been abandoned for years. But in the midst of all the decay, the house stood tall, unyielding, as though daring me to approach. I hesitated. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but I couldn't do it. I had come this far. I needed to know what waited inside. The ground outside the house was quiet, eerily so. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating something or someone. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. It felt strangely cold for a summer evening. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my eyes scanning the house, searching for any sign of life. But there was nothing. Not a single movement, not a whisper of sound. I approached the door, my steps hesitant but determined. My hand reached for the handle, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I should turn back. But the memory of the photograph, the pull of the unfamiliar, kept me going. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the door handle. Then, without warning, it creaked open. The smell hit me first, a musty, stale scent, like old books mixed with something sharper, something metallic. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the corners of the room. The house seemed abandoned, yet somehow it didn't feel empty. There was a presence here, a lingering energy that I couldn't explain. I looked around, my eyes darting from one shadowed corner to the next. The dim light from the doorway illuminated only part of the room, leaving the rest in darkness. I had to squint to see anything at all. Then, I noticed something strange. On the wall near the back of the room, there was a painting. At least, I thought it was a painting, its edges blurred and worn, but the colors were unmistakable. It depicted the very house I was standing in, but the scene was different. The house was whole, vibrant even, as if it had once been alive, surrounded by people who looked familiar, but who I couldn't quite place. I took a step closer to the painting, my hand instinctively reaching out to touch it. As my fingers brushed against the frame, the air shifted. The house seemed to groan, as if awakening from a long slumber. Then, I heard it, a sound, faint at first, like a whisper on the wind. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house, somewhere beyond the darkness. A voice. A whisper. My name. I stepped back, my breath quickening. Was I hearing things? Or was there someone else here with me? The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Come closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, but my feet moved before my mind could stop them. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn to it, to the source of that voice, calling to me from the shadows. As I walked deeper into the house, the temperature dropped and the whisper grew louder. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. With every step, the house seemed to shift, changing around me. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew heavy with something unspoken. I followed the voice, my heart pounding, unsure of what I would find. The path was narrow, the darkness swallowing me whole. But there was no turning back now. The house had already begun to claim me. The air was thick now, stifling. I could barely breathe, my lungs heavy with the weight of something I couldn't quite place. The floorboards creaked beneath my every step, almost as though they were protesting my presence. The whisper, persistent and haunting, led me deeper into the house, urging me forward, though every instinct in my body screamed to stop. I pressed on, unable to stop myself. My hand brushed against the rough texture of the walls, the coldness seeping through my skin. It felt like the house itself was alive, breathing with me, watching me. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, the corners of the house disappearing into shadows that seemed to close in on me. Then, in the farthest corner of the room, I saw it, a door, barely visible against the wall. It wasn't large, and its edges were worn, hidden behind piles of debris and dust. But it called to me, like a secret longing, something waiting to be uncovered. I moved toward it, the whisper still echoing in my ears, guiding me. My fingers brushed against the cold handle, and for a moment, I hesitated. What lay behind this door? What waited for me in that hidden space? The whisper, now more like a demand, rang clear in my mind, open it. I turned the handle, and the door creaked open with a sound like a gasp, as if the house itself had exhaled. The room beyond was small, almost suffocating. Dim light filtered through cracks in the walls, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching on the dust-covered floor. The room was barren, except for a single object in the center. A mirror. It stood tall, its frame ornate and gilded, its surface so polished it seemed to shimmer. But as I gazed into the reflection, my heart skipped a beat. The image wasn't right. It wasn't me standing there. No, it was someone else, a figure in the mirror, obscured by shadows, a face I couldn't quite make out. They were staring back at me, their eyes wide, filled with something I couldn't understand. Something familiar. My body froze. The air seemed to grow even colder, the silence now deafening. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could feel the weight of that gaze, the coldness that radiated from the mirror. The figure in the reflection wasn't just staring at me, it was waiting. Waiting for something. The whisper returned, louder now, urgent, almost frantic. You shouldn't be here. I stepped back, my pulse racing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The figure, it looked like me, but not quite. The person in the mirror was a distorted version of myself, their features twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. Their eyes were too wide, their expression too empty, as if they were trying to tell me something, but couldn't. I stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the doorframe, trying to escape the suffocating pressure of the room. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look away from the mirror. The figure in the reflection smiled. It was slow, deliberate, and the smile didn't reach their eyes. The corners of their mouths stretched too far, and I could see their teeth, sharp and jagged, gleaming in the dim light. A chill ran down my spine, and panic surged through me. I had to get out. But just as I turned to flee, I heard it, a sound, low and almost inaudible, like something scraping against the mirror's surface. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned back, instinctively. The reflection of the figure was no longer just standing. They were moving. A hand reached out from the mirror, its fingers long and twisted, pressing against the glass as if it were trying to break free. The hand, pale and stretched beyond what was humanly possible, left behind streaks of blackness, as if the mirror were bleeding. I stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor. The whisper came again, more insistent, "Get out. Get out now." But my feet were frozen, locked in place by some unseen force. I watched in horror as the figure in the mirror slowly started to step forward. Its face twisted in agony, its expression a mix of pain and triumph. The glass rippled like water, bending and warping as though the mirror itself was alive. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was tight, my voice stolen by the terror that gripped me. Then, the figure's hand, long and gnarled, slid through the glass like it was made of liquid. It reached for me, its fingers curling toward my arm, its cold touch like ice. In that instant, I knew there was no escape. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls narrowing, the darkness swallowing me whole. The figure's grip tightened on my wrist, dragging me toward the mirror. I tried to pull away, but it was too strong. My heart raced, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers filled my ears, now more like a scream, demanding I follow, demanding I let go. I had no choice. I could feel the pull, the weight of the mirror's darkness dragging me toward it. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the room anymore. The mirror, the figure, the darkness, it was all gone. I was lying on a cold, hard surface, my body stiff and aching. The air was stale, thick with dust, and there was a strange, metallic smell that made my stomach churn. I sat up quickly, my heart still racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I was outside now, in an unfamiliar place. I looked around, disoriented, trying to grasp where I was. The ground beneath me was cracked, the sky above heavy with dark clouds, like a storm was on the horizon. It felt like I was standing at the edge of nowhere. But then, I saw something. A figure, standing in the distance. It was hard to make out, but the shape was familiar. The same twisted figure from the mirror. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure began to move toward me, its slow, deliberate steps echoing in the silence. The closer it got, the clearer it became. The face, it was my face, but warped, distorted in ways that made my stomach churn. The eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, bore into me with a kind of malevolent recognition. I could feel the pull again, the same weight that had dragged me into the mirror, trying to pull me back into its darkness. But this time, I refused to let it happen. I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed myself harder, faster, away from the figure that was still following me, its footsteps getting closer with every second. The ground beneath me was uneven, rocks and debris tripping me up, but I couldn't stop. I had to escape. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second, I saw it, my reflection, still chasing me. It wasn't just behind me anymore. It was everywhere, closing in from all sides. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, more insistent, like they were coming from inside my head. "You can't escape." I stumbled, falling to the ground, my palms scraping against the rough earth. I pushed myself up, gasping for breath. The figure was closing in, its twisted form becoming more tangible, more real. I ran faster, my mind racing. Where was I? How had I gotten here? The familiar signs of the road were gone. There was no way back. No way forward. I had to keep running, or it would catch me. And then, just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I saw it, another road sign, like the ones I had seen before. But this time, the sign was different. It wasn't just a direction. It was a warning. Road closed. I skidded to a halt, my heart skipping a beat. The road ahead was blocked, a barrier of twisted metal and concrete, like some kind of twisted obstacle course meant to trap me. I looked around, desperate for any way out, but the landscape was barren, nothing but endless, empty fields stretching for miles. The figure was almost upon me now, its breath hot and foul against my neck. I could feel its fingers reaching for me, the coldness of its touch sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what was happening, or how I had gotten here. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. And then, just as I thought I was about to be consumed by the darkness, something happened. The air around me seemed to shimmer, like a distortion in reality. A loud crack echoed through the air, followed by a sudden, blinding light. I closed my eyes, shielding my face, and when I opened them again, everything had changed. The figure was gone. The storm clouds had cleared, and the road, my road, was back. I could see the familiar signs in the distance, the ones that led me home. I was standing in the same place I had started, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew that it wasn't over. The whispers were still there, lurking at the edges of my mind, and the shadow of the figure still loomed in the corners of my thoughts. Something had changed, something that I couldn't quite understand, but I could feel it. And I knew, deep down, that the road I had just taken wasn't the last one. I had to keep moving. Because wherever I went, whatever I did, that twisted figure would be following me. And one day, it would catch me. But not today. Today, I was still alive. For now, I stood there, staring at the road in front of me. The sign was the same as it had always been. The road was open, unblocked. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the pavement. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The unease I'd felt before, the gnawing sense of being watched, hadn't disappeared. It was still there, lingering in the air around me, as if the world itself had changed and I hadn't noticed. I took a deep breath and started walking. I couldn't stay in this place forever. I had to keep moving forward, even if I didn't know where that road would lead. I had to try to make sense of everything that had happened. The mirror, the strange figure, the voices, it all felt like a dream, but I knew it wasn't. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The road seemed to stretch farther than it should have. It curved in ways I didn't remember. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by unfamiliar buildings and landscapes. The town I knew, the places I had passed countless times, none of it was here. The world was different, and I was no longer sure if I was in the same reality I had woken up in. But then, I saw it. A familiar shape standing by the side of the road. It was a figure, dressed in the same clothes I had seen before. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Was it the figure from before? The one that had haunted me through the darkness? I wasn't sure. I walked closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. It just stood there, as still as a statue. The closer I got, the clearer it became it wasn't the same figure at all. It was me. The person standing in front of me had my face, my features, but there was something off about it. The expression was empty, like it had no soul behind it. The eyes, those same hollow eyes from the mirror, stared back at me, filled with an unsettling darkness. I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. And then, something strange happened. The air around me began to shift again. The ground beneath my feet trembled slightly, as if the world was warping, twisting. I felt it, a pull, gentle at first, but growing stronger. It was the same pull that had dragged me through the mirror, that had brought me to that strange place. But this time, it felt different. More purposeful. More controlled. I turned away from the figure, my heart pounding. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I didn't want to know what it meant. I started walking faster, the world around me beginning to blur as I moved. The whispers from before, those voices that had haunted me, came rushing back. This time, they were louder. More insistent. You can't escape. You're already here. The ground trembled again, harder this time. I could feel the earth shifting beneath me, as though it was breaking apart, pulling me into the unknown. I pushed forward, not knowing where I was going, not caring anymore. All I wanted was to escape. Escape from the pull, from the whispers, from the figure that had become my shadow. And then, I saw it. The road ahead was different now. It was no longer just a stretch of asphalt. It was a path, one I hadn't seen before. It was surrounded by thick trees, their branches twisting and turning, blocking out the sun. The air was cooler, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. I had no choice but to follow it. There was no going back. With each step, I could feel the pull grow stronger, the whispers louder. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I walked down the path, not knowing what lay ahead, but knowing one thing for sure, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And whatever came next, I had to face it. The road ahead may have changed, but so had I. And now, I was ready for whatever came next. Have you ever found something in the most unlikely of places, something so strange that it made you question your own memories? I never thought I would, but it happened to me. One cold afternoon, I was cleaning out an old coat that had been hanging in the back of my closet for years. It was the kind of coat you rarely wear anymore, the kind you forget about until it's time for another deep cleaning session. As I reached into one of the pockets, my fingers brushed against something unusual, something crinkled, not the usual lint or forgotten change. I pulled it out and unfolded the small, weathered piece of paper. A receipt. I stared at it for a moment. The date on it was recent, no more than a few weeks old. But the strange thing was, I didn't recognize the store name. The items listed on it were even stranger. A brand of coffee I had never bought, a set of tools I had no interest in, and a pair of shoes that weren't even my size. The total was listed in bold at the bottom, and it was more than I'd ever spent on anything. I didn't remember purchasing any of these things. In fact, I was sure I hadn't. The more I looked at it, the more unsettled I felt. I checked the name on the receipt, but it was unfamiliar to me too. There was no address, just a phone number at the bottom. My first instinct was to toss it out, to ignore it and move on, but something about the receipt kept nagging at me. The next day, I went to work as usual, but the receipt stayed on my mind. I found myself thinking about it constantly, wondering who had bought those things. I didn't know anyone who had those kinds of interests. I didn't know anyone who had been in that store. After work, I decided to follow the impulse. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find, but the nagging feeling wouldn't let me rest until I visited the store on the receipt. It wasn't far, just a few blocks away. I arrived at the location, only to find that the store was tucked away in a narrow alley, almost hidden from view. The neon sign above the door flickered, casting a sickly glow. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The door creaked as it opened, and the bell above it rang softly. The air inside was thick with the smell of old paper and something metallic. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. The shelves were stocked with items I couldn't recognize, mostly odds and ends, little trinkets, and odd gadgets that seemed out of place. I approached the counter, hoping someone was working. But as I looked behind it, the space was empty, almost eerily so. I waited for a moment, but there was no response. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a little louder than I intended. "Is anyone here?" Still nothing. I walked around the counter, looking behind it, but it was just an empty space. No staff, no customers, just a dusty, forgotten corner of the world. I turned back toward the door, but before I reached it, something caught my eye. On the counter, almost hidden beneath a pile of papers, was another receipt. It looked nearly identical to the one I had found in my coat pocket. Same store name, same logo, same products, only this one had a different name written at the top. I couldn't help myself. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hand, as though it was drawing me in. But the moment my fingers touched the paper, I heard something. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder, a slow, rhythmic tapping. I turned, looking around, but there was no one else in the store. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, like something was tapping just out of sight. I froze. The receipt in my hand felt like it was burning. I dropped it quickly and stepped back. The tapping continued, faster now, almost like footsteps following me. I needed to leave. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Without looking back, I rushed to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and pushed it open. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running until I was back out on the street, gasping for breath. I had the strangest feeling I wasn't supposed to be there. That something wasn't right about that store, that receipt, and the things I'd seen. As I made my way home, the receipt still in my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened was just the beginning. Something was waiting. Something more was coming. And I wasn't sure I could escape it. The days after my strange visit to the shop felt heavy, as though a thick fog had settled over my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the receipt, the odd tapping in the store, and the chilling silence that had followed me out. At night, I found myself tossing and turning, hearing the tapping again and again in my dreams. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, other times like knocks on a door I couldn't open. Every time I woke up, drenched in sweat, I told myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of my mind. But it didn't feel like just a dream. It felt real. The next day, I decided I needed answers. I couldn't let it go. I had to return to that store to understand what was really going on. I had to know why I had found that receipt in my pocket, why the store felt so wrong. As I walked the same path toward the alley where the shop was, I noticed something different. The streets seemed quieter, emptier, as though the world around me had been dulled. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, where something was waiting for me. When I reached the alley, I was surprised to find that the store was still there, still tucked away in its shadowed corner. The neon sign flickered again, just as it had the other day. But now, it felt more oppressive, as though it were calling me in. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, the familiar creak of the door welcoming me once more. The bell above it rang softly, but this time I didn't feel quite as nervous. I'd been here before. I knew what to expect. But when I stepped inside, things were different. The air was colder. The shelves were still stocked with the strange, unrecognizable objects, but now they seemed more alive. They were arranged more carefully, almost deliberately. It was as if someone had been expecting me. I walked toward the counter, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The store was empty, just like before. But this time, I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I approached the counter again, but this time I didn't wait. I leaned over and looked behind it, expecting to find the same empty space. But instead, there was something else, something I hadn't seen before. A drawer, half open. I felt an overwhelming urge to open it. I didn't know why, but it felt like I had no choice. Something was pushing me forward, urging me to look inside. I reached for the drawer, my hand trembling slightly, and pulled it open. Inside, there was nothing but a single sheet of paper, carefully folded. I unfolded it, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw what was written on it. It was another receipt. The same store name, the same items, but the date was earlier than the one I had found in my coat pocket. And at the top of the receipt, in bold letters, was my name. I didn't understand. How was this possible? I hadn't bought any of these things. I hadn't even been to this store until today. Yet here it was, my name written on a receipt for items I had never seen before. Suddenly, I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't just from the walls. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing. The store was still empty, but the tapping grew louder, clearer. It was coming closer, each step more deliberate than the last. I could feel the presence of something approaching, something waiting. I backed away from the counter, my eyes darting around the room. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. The feeling of being watched intensified. And then, I saw it. In the corner of the store, just at the edge of the dim light, a figure stood. It was tall, too tall, with a shape that didn't quite make sense. It was like a person, but not quite. The edges of it seemed to shimmer and bend, as though it was more shadow than substance. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The tapping stopped. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. It was as if it was waiting for me to make the next move, to do something, anything. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing to comprehend what I was seeing. Then, without warning, the figure started to move toward me. Slowly, deliberately. I turned and ran. The door flew open as I bolted out of the store, the bell ringing violently behind me. The cold air hit me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The feeling of that thing following me, its cold presence lingering in the space I had just left, made me run faster. I didn't stop until I was back home, my hand shaking as I locked the door behind me. I leaned against it, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. I had no answers. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever I had just encountered was not something I could explain. and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out more. But I had to. There was still one thing left to do. I had to find out who was behind the receipt. The night passed slowly, the silence in my apartment heavy with questions I couldn't answer. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure from the store. The shape, the darkness, the way it seemed to shift with the shadows, it haunted me. Every creak of the building, every shift in the wind, made my heart race. I kept thinking about the receipt with my name on it. It felt wrong. It felt like a message, a sign, but from who? And why me? I spent the next day trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to creep into every corner of my thoughts. Every noise, every movement in my peripheral vision made me jump. I couldn't escape it. I needed answers. I couldn't leave things the way they were, knowing something was out there, something I couldn't explain. I decided to go back to the store once again. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was the only way to find out what was really happening. The thought of returning there made my stomach churn, but I had no choice. If I was ever going to make sense of the receipt, of the strange figure, I needed to confront it directly. As I walked toward the alley, I felt the same uneasy chill I had experienced before. It wasn't just the coldness of the air, it was something deeper, something that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. The world felt off balance, like the space around me was stretching and warping. When I reached the spot where the store should have been, I froze. It wasn't there. The alley was just as narrow and dark as it had been before, but now it was empty. The walls of the buildings on either side seemed to close in on me, the air thick with tension. The store was gone. There was no sign of the faded neon lights, no bell above the door, no faint tapping in the air. My first thought was that I had imagined it all. Maybe I had been sleep deprived, seeing things that weren't really there. But the receipts, the strange feeling I had every time I thought about them, they couldn't have been imagined. I stepped further into the alley, squinting in the dim light, searching for any trace of the shop. But there was nothing. The space was as ordinary as any other alley in the city, filled with trash and the scent of decay. I felt my heart sink. Where had it gone? Just as I was about to turn and leave, I noticed something. A small piece of paper, crumpled and discarded, half hidden beneath a pile of old boxes. I hesitated. Something told me to leave it alone, but my curiosity got the best of me. I walked over and bent down to pick it up. When I unfolded it, I froze. It was another receipt. The same store name. The same items. But this one was dated today. I didn't understand. How could this be? The store wasn't here anymore. The receipt in my hand couldn't be real. I was standing in an empty alley, far from any store, yet the paper in my hand felt solid, real. I turned it over, hoping for an answer, hoping to see something that would make sense of it all. There, written in tiny letters, was an address. A location I didn't recognize. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, pulling me in different directions. On one hand, I could walk away, pretend like none of this had happened. But something inside me, something darker, more pressing, told me I couldn't ignore this. I couldn't leave it behind. I had to find the address. I glanced around one last time, half expecting to see the shadowed figure lurking in the distance, watching me. But the alley was empty. Still. Quiet. With the receipt clutched tightly in my hand, I started walking. The address on the paper was located on the outskirts of the city, in a part of town I didn't often visit. It was far from the main roads, deep in a neighborhood that seemed forgotten, abandoned. I took a bus, then walked the last few blocks, my nerves fraying with every step. The closer I got, the more unsettled I became. The buildings here were older, more run down. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few people who looked like they were lost in their own thoughts. The air had a strange, musty smell, like old wood and damp stone. Finally, I reached the address. It was an old, crumbling building, an apartment complex that had seen better days. Its windows were boarded up, the paint peeling off the walls. The entrance was dark, the door barely hanging on its hinges. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything inside me screamed to turn around and leave. But I had come this far. I couldn't stop now. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air in the building was thick with dust. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb. The silence was almost deafening, but I could feel something in the shadows that made my skin crawl. I followed the hallway until I came to an apartment door. The number on the door matched the one from the receipt. I hesitated. Then I knocked. The knock echoed through the building, a sharp, unsettling sound that seemed to reverberate off the walls, sending a shiver down my spine. My heart pounded harder now, and I could hear my breath coming in shallow bursts. I didn't know what I expected, but nothing prepared me for what happened next. A faint creaking noise reached my ears, and the door slowly swung open. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty doorway. No one was standing behind it. The apartment inside was dimly lit, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. There was no sign of life, no footsteps, no voices. I stepped forward, instinctively pushing the door open wider. As I entered, the air felt colder, and a sense of unease settled over me. The room was sparse, furnished only with a few worn-out pieces of furniture. A small, cracked mirror hung on the far wall. The place looked abandoned, as though no one had lived here in years. I glanced around, trying to make sense of why the receipt had led me here. There were no obvious answers, no clues that seemed to explain the strange happenings. But there was something off about the apartment. A lingering sense of dread seemed to permeate the space, creeping into every corner. I took another step into the room, my mind racing with questions. How had the receipt ended up in my pocket? Why had it led me here, to this strange, empty place? And who had sent it to me? The figure in the alley, the empty store, the mysterious address, it all felt like a puzzle, each piece leading me deeper into something I couldn't understand. As I moved further into the apartment, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the small coffee table in the center of the room, there was an object. A single item, sitting there as if waiting for me. It was a receipt. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The same name, the same store, the same items. But this receipt was dated only a few hours ago. My stomach churned. How could this be? How could there be another receipt here when no one had been here? It didn't make sense. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The moment I touched the paper, I felt a strange energy pulse through me. The sensation was brief, but it left me with a deep sense of foreboding. I couldn't explain it, but something about the receipt felt wrong in a way that I couldn't put into words. I turned it over, hoping for some explanation, but there was nothing. No address, no message, just the same blank space on the back. But something was different this time. As I stared at the paper, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible writing on the edge. It was small, too small to see clearly at first, but as I squinted, the words began to form. You've been chosen. A chill ran through me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My hands shook as I clutched the receipt tighter, my pulse quickening. What did this mean? Who had written this? And why me? Suddenly, the room around me seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, and the silence was broken by a faint, distant sound, like the soft tap of footsteps. They were coming closer, growing louder with each passing second. I turned quickly, but there was no one in the doorway. The apartment was still empty, yet the footsteps continued, now echoing through the narrow hall, as though someone, or something, was approaching. Panic surged through me. I had to leave. I had to get out. But my feet felt rooted to the spot, as if something was holding me there. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, just as I was about to turn and run, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one. The apartment was silent again, the footsteps stopping as quickly as they had started. But something was different. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and I could feel a presence in the room with me, something unseen, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I backed away, my hand reaching for the door handle. But when I touched it, the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic bubbled up inside me. I pulled harder, banging on the door, shouting for someone to help. But there was no response. My breath quickened, and I turned back to the room, scanning the space for any way out. That's when I saw it, a small, dark shape moving in the corner of the room. A figure, half hidden in the shadows, watching me. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence in the room like a weight pressing on me. The figure was watching me. Waiting. I was no longer alone. The figure in the corner of the room did not move, but its presence was unmistakable. My heart raced, and a chill spread across my body. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the door, my mind screaming for an escape. The door, still locked, was a trap. There was no way out. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on me as I tried to steady my breath. I had no choice but to confront whatever this was. My eyes darted around, desperately searching for something, anything, that might offer a clue or a way to break free. The receipt, still in my hand, felt heavier than ever. It was as if it had become a weight that anchored me to this place. I forced my legs to move, one step at a time, unwilling to take my eyes off the shadowy figure. As I inched closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The figure wasn't just standing there, it was holding something. A piece of paper, just like the one I had found in my pocket earlier. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. It was another receipt. I couldn't explain why, but the connection between the receipts, the one in my hand, the one in the room, and the one I had found earlier, felt like the key to this madness. But before I could move closer, the room seemed to shift again. The air grew denser, suffocating, and the temperature plummeted. Then, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a whisper, but not from the figure. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The voice was distant, but its message was clear. You've been chosen. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating in the empty space, as if they were written on every surface of the room. The figure took a step forward, its shape becoming clearer in the dim light. But it still wasn't human, not entirely. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like something that wasn't meant to move like that. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. My hands shook uncontrollably, the receipt now crumpling in my grip. The figure moved closer, its eyes glowing faintly, though I couldn't tell if they were real or imagined. But the sensation was the same. It was as though it could see through me, into me. I turned again, my body lurching as I tried the door one more time. This time, there was no resistance. The door opened with an unnerving creak, as if it had always been waiting for me to try again. Without thinking, I pushed through the doorway and into the dark hallway. I ran, my breath ragged, not daring to look back. The footsteps I had heard earlier were now right behind me, echoing with every frantic step I took. My heart hammered in my chest, my thoughts scattered until I reached the stairs. I glanced behind me. The hallway was empty. But I didn't feel alone. It was as if someone, was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I reached the ground floor, the door to the outside world within my grasp. I could hear the sound of the wind howling through the cracks, the rush of air beckoning me forward. But the moment I stepped outside, I felt it, the weight of the receipt still in my pocket, like a hidden hand, pulling me back. I turned around, the door to the building now shut tight behind me. For a brief second, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow in the window. But it was gone before I could be sure. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, the world around me feeling distant, surreal. The street was empty, the city quiet in the early morning haze. But I knew I couldn't just walk away. The receipt, the figure, the whispering voice, it all had to mean something. I couldn't shake the feeling that the real horror was only beginning. Have you ever looked out of your window in the middle of the night and felt the eerie sensation that you're being watched? It's the sort of feeling that creeps up on you slowly, like an itch you can't scratch. At first, you think it's just your imagination, a trick of the light, but then the doubt begins to settle in. Something isn't right. That was exactly how it started for me. It was a quiet evening, one of those nights where everything feels still, the air thick with the silence of the city below. I had just finished dinner, washed up, and now I was sitting by the window, staring out into the dark, letting my mind wander. The apartment was on the 10th floor, so the view was panoramic, the lights of the city twinkling far below like scattered stars. There was nothing extraordinary about the view, but there was something unsettling. I first noticed it in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving past my window. At first, I thought it was just a passing car or the reflection of a bird flying too close, but then it happened again. A figure, tall and dark, moved quickly across the glass. It was swift, but unmistakable. I froze, my eyes locked on the spot where the shadow had been. My heart skipped a beat as I waited for any movement. I didn't dare blink. The city outside was quiet, no sound, just the low hum of distant traffic. I strained my eyes, watching the street below, the buildings across the way. But there was nothing. No one. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I leaned forward, my hands pressed against the cool window. Maybe it had been nothing, maybe just a reflection of something passing. But no! There it was again. This time, I was sure of it. A figure moving, slowly, deliberately, just outside my window. I could barely make out its shape, but it was unmistakable, a silhouette of a person, tall and thin. It moved past, just beyond the reach of the light from the street below. I held my breath, my eyes widening. Was someone standing on the fire escape? Could someone be climbing up to my window? The thought was absurd. No one would be that bold, not on the 10th floor. But as I pressed my face closer to the glass, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The figure moved again, but this time it was slower, as if it was aware that I was watching. I jerked back from the window, my pulse racing. My mind tried to make sense of what I had seen. Had I imagined it? Was it possible that it was just a trick of the shadows, some optical illusion caused by the streetlights? I stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark window, waiting for anything to happen. The stillness of the night seemed to stretch on forever. Then, the sound, faint, almost inaudible, came from the direction of the window. A slight tap. A quiet, rhythmic sound, like something gently knocking against the glass. I blinked, my heart leaping in my chest. My mind screamed that I should move away, but my feet wouldn't budge. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist. With a slow, trembling hand, I reached for the curtain, pulling it back just enough to peer outside. The window was empty. There was no one there. No figure, no silhouette. Just the dark expanse of the city below, the lights twinkling innocently in the distance. I breathed a sigh of relief, my hands still gripping the curtain. Maybe I was just tired, imagining things. But as I was about to turn away, my eyes caught something. There were fingerprints on the glass. I hadn't noticed them before, but now they were impossible to miss, clear, smudged imprints, as though someone had placed their hands on the window. There were no other marks, no sign of a struggle or disturbance. Just those faint, chilling prints lingering on the glass like a ghostly reminder. My breath caught in my throat. The prints were too fresh to be from days ago, yet I hadn't heard anyone come close to the window. The fire escape was out of sight, and there was no balcony to stand on. Someone had been outside. Someone had been watching me. I backed away from the window, my mind racing, but the strange sense of unease wouldn't leave. I checked the locks on the door, then the windows, but there was no sign of forced entry. Everything was as it should be. And yet, the prints were still there. It wasn't my imagination. Something, or someone, had been outside my window, watching me. And I was not ready to face whatever it was. I spent the next few hours pacing around my apartment, unable to shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The city outside, once a comforting backdrop to my evenings, now seemed like a vast, distant world. The quiet hum of the streets below felt more suffocating than soothing. Every little sound seemed to echo in the silence, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains felt like an intruder in my thoughts. I kept glancing over at the window, half expecting to see those fingerprints again, but the glass was clear now. I had wiped them off, or at least I thought I had. But the memory of them lingered like a cold draft in the room. Could I have imagined it? Maybe I was just tired, exhausted from a long week, my mind playing tricks on me. But the fear, that gnawing feeling in my stomach, refused to fade. I decided to try to forget about it. I pulled the curtains closed, shutting out the view entirely. The apartment, once cozy, now felt confining. As the night wore on, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. My phone sat on the nightstand, glowing faintly, a constant reminder of the world outside. But I didn't want to look at it. Not now. Not when I felt so unsettled. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it again. At first, it was just a faint sound, like someone gently tapping on the window. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was soft, rhythmic, as though someone was trying to get my attention. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it a bird? Maybe a branch scraping against the glass? But the tapping was too precise, too deliberate. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. Slowly, cautiously, I moved toward the window. The apartment was eerily quiet, no sounds from the street, no hum of traffic, just silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. When I reached the window, I hesitated. The fear had returned, crawling under my skin. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peer outside. Nothing. Just the empty expanse of the city, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, no figure in sight. I let out a shaky breath and closed the curtain quickly, trying to reassure myself that it was just the wind or some other natural explanation. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shadow moving across the glass. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't a figure standing still, it was something faster, more fluid. A blur moving quickly from one side of the window to the other. I gasped and stumbled back, my mind reeling. How could it be? The window was too high for anyone to be walking outside. No one could climb up to this floor without being noticed, and yet, there it was. The shadow, moving, just beyond my reach. The tap came again, this time louder. 3 knocks in quick succession, followed by a pause, and then another tap. It was rhythmic, intentional. Whoever, or whatever, was outside knew I was watching. I wanted to run. I wanted to lock myself away somewhere, but my feet were rooted to the spot, my body frozen in place by a mix of fear and curiosity. Slowly, I moved back to the window, unable to tear my gaze away from the place where the shadow had been. With shaking hands, I opened the window just a crack, enough to let in the cool night air. I pressed my face against the glass, straining to see beyond the faint glow of the streetlights. Nothing. The shadow was gone. The window was empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. My eyes darted over the street below, searching for any sign of movement. But the world outside seemed still, too still. I closed the window quickly, locking it with trembling hands. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with questions. Who was out there? Why were they watching me? And why did it feel like they knew I was here, in this apartment, all alone? The silence settled around me once more, but it was different now. It wasn't comforting, it was suffocating, like the world had grown smaller, more oppressive. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. I grabbed my phone, dialing the number of my friend Claire. I needed to hear a familiar voice, something to ground me. It rang once, twice, 3 times. And then, finally, she picked up. Hello? Her voice was groggy, as though I had woken her from sleep. Claire, I think someone's been outside my window. Someone's been watching me. Her voice was suddenly alert, tinged with concern. What do you mean? Are you okay? I don't know. I saw a figure earlier, and now I keep hearing tapping, and before I could finish, I heard it again. The tap. This time, louder. More urgent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Claire, it's happening again. I have to go. I hung up quickly, my hands shaking. I approached the window again, my heart hammering in my chest. This time, I didn't hesitate. I threw open the curtain, my eyes wide as I scanned the darkness. And there, on the glass, were the prints. Again. But this time, they were different. There was something new. A message smeared into the glass, as though someone had written it with their fingers. Help me. My blood ran cold as I stared at the glass. The words help me were written clearly in what appeared to be smudged fingerprints, the shapes distorted as though they had been pressed hard against the surface. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them, my mind racing to make sense of it. Had I missed it before? Was it there the entire time, just waiting for me to notice? I reached forward instinctively, my fingers brushing against the glass as if I could somehow wipe away the message, erase the feeling of dread that now had a physical form. But the words didn't disappear. They stayed, mocking me with their urgency. My hand hovered over the glass, trembling. There was something terrifyingly real about them. Something desperate. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. The apartment, which had felt like my safe haven just hours before, now seemed foreign, suffocating. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my coat, my mind still spinning. Could it be a prank? But no one knew about the apartment. No one even knew I lived here. And the taps, the shadows, none of it made sense. I had to leave. But as I reached for the door, I paused. Something stopped me. That gut feeling, the one that had been gnawing at me all night, told me that whatever was happening wasn't just a strange coincidence. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I turned back toward the window. The words help me were still there, glaring at me. But now, in the dim light, I noticed something else. Something that hadn't been there before. A figure. A shadow, standing on the rooftop across the street. Its outline was blurry, almost like a mirage, but it was there. I could feel it watching me, its presence somehow more tangible than the words on the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But what would I say? Someone's writing on my window and tapping on it, and now they're standing across the street watching me? I grabbed my phone again, dialing Claire's number for the second time that night. I was desperate for someone to explain what was happening, to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. The phone rang and rang. No answer. I put the phone down in frustration, my hand still shaking. The figure across the street didn't move. It just stood there, staring, waiting. I couldn't do this alone. I needed help. I needed someone who could make sense of this, someone who could tell me that this was all just a horrible mistake. I looked back at the window, and the figure was gone. Had I imagined it? Was I just too tired, too afraid? I turned back toward the window and stared at the glass. The words help me were still there. But now, they seemed to be moving. No, I wasn't imagining it. The words were shifting, ever so slightly, as if someone was still pressing their fingers against the glass, leaving new prints. I reached for the phone again, my heart pounding in my chest. I dialed Claire's number once more. This time, she picked up on the first ring. "Claire," I said, my voice shaky, "I need you to come over. Now. Something's happening. I don't know what's going on, but I can't stay here alone. Please." "Okay, calm down. I'm on my way. Just stay inside, all right?" I hung up and paced back and forth, every step echoing in the silence. The words on the window, The figure, the tapping, my mind couldn't grasp it all. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't face this alone. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, I heard a knock on the door. Claire's voice called out from the other side. "Jess, it's me. Let me in." I rushed to the door and opened it without hesitation, relief flooding over me as I saw her standing there, her face filled with concern. "What's going on?" You sound terrified," she said, stepping inside. I didn't know where to begin. The words, the tapping, the figure outside. How could I explain it all? Would she believe me? "Claire, look outside," I said, pointing toward the window. "Look at the glass." Claire turned toward the window, and for a moment, everything was still. She took a step forward, her brow furrowed. But then, her face went pale. She reached out slowly, pressing her hand to the glass. The words. The same message, "Help me." But Claire didn't pull her hand back. She pressed harder, her fingers leaving fresh smudges on the glass. She leaned in closer, her breath fogging the surface as she whispered, "Jess, we're not alone." Before I could react, the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't just on the window. It came from all around the apartment, walls, doors, even the ceiling. As if something was moving inside the walls, closing in on us. I grabbed Claire's arm, pulling her back. "We need to leave. Now." But the door wouldn't open. It was locked, jammed. We couldn't get out. The tapping grew louder. Closer. And then, there was a voice, soft at first, like a whisper, but growing clearer with every passing second. "Help me. Jess. Claire." My heart skipped a beat as the voice echoed through the room, calling our names. It was as if something was in the room with us. I froze, Claire's hand gripping mine tightly. The tapping had stopped, but the voice, soft and pleading, still lingered in the air. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound confident. "Show yourself." But there was no response. Just the hollow silence, punctuated by the steady thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. Claire looked at me, her face pale. I don't know, Jess. This isn't normal. This can't be real." I didn't have an answer for her. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening. Was it a prank? Was someone outside trying to scare us? But how could they have done all this? The fingerprints on the window, the voice, the tapping coming from every direction. It was too much to be a coincidence. Claire took a hesitant step toward the window, her breath shallow. "Let's look outside. Maybe we can see something, someone." I shook my head. "No, Claire. I can't. I don't want to look." But she was already there, peering through the blinds. I could see her expression change, the blood draining from her face. "Jess, you need to see this." I stepped forward, and my stomach twisted in knots. Slowly, I joined her at the window, and together, we peered out. The street below was quiet, empty. The streetlights flickered as usual, and cars occasionally passed, oblivious to the events unfolding above. But then, something caught my eye. There, on the rooftop of the building across the street, stood the figure again. The same shadow from before. It was larger now, more distinct, but still shrouded in an unnatural darkness. I could feel it staring up at us, and for a moment I thought I saw its eyes, glowing, burning with an otherworldly intensity. Before I could speak, Claire gasped. "It's moving." And it was. The shadow, now more defined, was creeping closer. But it wasn't walking. It was gliding, floating, like it wasn't even touching the ground. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if it knew exactly where it was headed. "Claire, what is that?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely audible. "But it's not human." I turned away from the window, a surge of panic rising in my chest. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the air around me seemed to thicken, suffocating me. "Okay," I said, swallowing hard. "We need to get out of here. I don't care what it is, something's not right. We can't stay here." But when I turned to the door, my heart sank. The door was gone. The doorway I had just used moments ago to step into the room was no longer there. In its place was a solid, impenetrable wall of blackness, as though the apartment had transformed around us. There was no way out. "Jess, this isn't happening, right?" Claire whispered, her voice cracking. This is a nightmare." I reached for the phone, hoping that calling for help would somehow make everything better, but the screen was dark. The phone was dead, completely unresponsive. "We're trapped," I said, my voice thick with fear. "I don't know how, but we're trapped." And then the voice returned. Louder this time, more insistent. "Help me, please." Claire and I both spun toward the source of the sound, but there was no one there. No figure. No one at the window. But the voice, it came from within the apartment. It was as if it was coming from the walls themselves, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to crawl into our ears, making my skin prickle with dread. I stepped back, my mind struggling to keep up with the surreal horror unfolding around us. "Where is it coming from?" I asked, my breath shallow, my chest tightening. "I don't know," Claire said, her voice rising with panic. "It's everywhere." And then the tapping returned. This time it was relentless. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, every surface seemed to be alive, pulsing with the sound of invisible hands pressing against them. The glass on the window. I turned back to it, and my heart almost stopped. The words were there again, but now they weren't just words. They were expanding, twisting, becoming something else. The faint smudge of fingerprints had grown into long, thin lines, almost like claw marks. But they were still forming. I could see them now, in full. The words stretched out into a sentence. "Get out. Now." Claire screamed. The figure from across the street was no longer on the rooftop. It was here, right in front of us, in the reflection on the glass. I could see it standing behind us, its shadow stretching across the floor. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was something much darker, much more menacing. "Jess." Claire gasped, her voice cracking. "It's here." Before I could turn to face it, the entire room seemed to pulse. The lights flickered violently, and the walls seemed to shake, as though the very foundation of the building was under assault. And then, in one final, deafening moment of silence, the glass shattered. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know what to do. The room was spinning, the walls closing in, and the only thing I could focus on was the shadow, now a full figure, looming over me, its eyes glowing, its presence suffocating. I reached for Claire, but she was gone. And then everything went black. I woke with a start, gasping for air. The blackness around me was all-encompassing, as though I had been buried in the deepest of voids. I couldn't remember how I had fallen unconscious or what had happened after the glass shattered. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the disorienting pulse of my thoughts. When my eyes finally adjusted, I realized I was no longer in the apartment. The room I was in now was unfamiliar, cold, and sterile, like a hospital room, but it didn't have the typical clinical smell or the usual hum of machines. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. I could hear footsteps. Faint, but distinct. Soft steps, like someone walking toward me. I wasn't alone. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry, constricted. A low groan escaped as I looked around, trying to understand where I was. It was a small, dimly lit room with only a single window. The bed I was lying on was old and uncomfortable, the sheets stiff, like they hadn't been changed in years. The footsteps grew louder. I wanted to move, to get up and run, but my body felt frozen. Panic clawed at my insides as I tried to stand, but my legs wobbled beneath me, as if I hadn't walked in days. Then, the door opened. I flinched, expecting some terrible figure to appear, the shadow from the window perhaps, but it wasn't the shadow. It was a man. A stranger, but not a menacing one. He was tall, with tired eyes and a quiet demeanor. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You're awake," he said softly, his voice low, almost comforting in its tone. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was still reeling from the horror, trying to piece together what had happened. "Where am I?" I managed to croak out. The man hesitated before speaking again. "You're in a safe place. A place where you can rest." I blinked, confused. Safe? How was this place safe? I had been trapped. The glass had shattered. The figure, where was it? Where was Claire? I turned, looking desperately around the room. "Claire, where's Claire?" I asked, my voice rising with panic. The man's face darkened slightly, his expression tightening. He stepped closer to me, placing a gentle hand on my arm, urging me to calm down. "There was no one else with you. It was just you, alone, when we found you." I shook my head. "No. There was someone with me, Claire, my friend. She was right next to me. We were both in that room." The man remained silent for a moment, his eyes studying me carefully. "No one else was with you when we found you in the building. You were the only one. And you weren't just unconscious. You were different." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I couldn't understand. "What do you mean different?" "Your eyes," he said, almost whispering now. "When you woke up, your eyes were not your own. They were like the shadows." I felt a chill run down my spine. His words struck me hard, like a blow to my chest. What did that mean? The shadows? The thing outside the window? I looked down at my hands, trembling, trying to ground myself, to remind myself that this was real. But everything felt wrong. The room felt wrong. This man, was he telling the truth? Or was it all part of the nightmare I had somehow escaped? How long was I out? I asked, my voice shaky. "About a day," he replied. "You were unconscious for most of that time, but when you came to, You weren't the same. I couldn't understand. How could I not be the same? What was he talking about? I had been trapped in the apartment with that shadow, the tapping, the words on the glass. Why did you bring me here? I asked, more demand than question. He sighed, stepping back. You were in danger. Something was after you. We couldn't leave you there. I shook my head in disbelief. Who are you? What is happening? The man hesitated before answering, his gaze now averted. I'm someone who's seen this before. I've been watching, waiting for the right moment. It's not the first time this has happened. Not the first time someone has been drawn into the darkness. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Drawn into the darkness? What does that mean? The shadows are alive, he said slowly, almost as if he were talking to himself. They feed on fear, on loneliness, on doubt. They follow, they wait for the right moment to take someone. To claim them. You were chosen. I stared at him, completely lost. The idea of shadows coming to life, feeding on fear, it was too much. My mind screamed for logic, for something real, something I could understand, but everything felt wrong, like the ground beneath me was crumbling away. Chosen for what? I managed to whisper. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. You've been marked. The shadows aren't finished with you. They won't stop until they get what they want. The words sank into me like ice. I felt the weight of his gaze, the knowledge in his eyes. I had thought I was free, that I had escaped, but now I understood the truth. The terror had only just begun. I wasn't safe. I was never going to be safe again. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.